Hello guys, welcome to the second screencast on recovery. So this is, we're going to have a looking at EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption part 2, or the slow component. It's a quick recap on what we did in our last screencast. So the last screencast had a look at the fast component of EPOC, as you can see here, and particularly we had a look at the kind of duration of it, alongside kind of how this fast component of EPOC allows us to replenish our blood and muscle oxygen stores, and then on top of that we looked at how we got these ATP and PC stores back. So today's screencast then is going to particularly focus on the slow component. So we're going to be looking at the following key things. We're going to be looking at kind of the elevation of circulation rates, ventilation rates, body temperature, and then to start with we're going to have a look specifically at how the lactate or lactic acid is removed, and also how we look at the kind of this process of converting lactic acid into glycogen to allow us to kind of get our energy back following exercise. So that's what we're going to have a look at. We'll have a look at this in the lesson to come, but this screencast will particularly focus on the slow component of EPOC. Okay, so just going on to here then, if you just go back onto our recovery graph just to get us back into where we're going with this. So if you have a look, this is the thing I said to on the last screencast is, when we exercise, certain things deplete. We deplete our ATP and PC stores, our glycogen is depleted, oxygen is removed from myoglobin, and also we have an accumulation of lactic acid. Now, as I said, just to repeat what I said earlier, the last session we had a look at kind of this excess post-exercise oxygen consumption and the fast component. As you can see, EPOC is used to fuel both of those systems. You look here, the fast component I've just coloured in blue. Okay, so if you look at the blue, in our last session we specifically looked at how this ATP and PC were kind of recovered or synthesized or replenished via endothermic reactions, and we also had a look at how kind of this fast component of EPOC allowed us to create the oxygen in order to form oxymyoglobin, oxyhemoglobin. Now, what we've got left, as you can see in the red, is glycogen and lactic acid. So that will show you these things that kind of happen in exercise, or these kind of negative things that happen. We can now have a look at how the final two things kind of replenished during our slow component of recovery. So let's have a look then. I'll put the triggers here because I thought these would work well. Now you know how this is going to work. So if we go down to start with, just nice and easy, when we're looking at the slow component of EPOC, or the lactic acid recovery, we are looking first of all a bit of repetition just to get you into it and get you onto the kind of mark scheme. So it's the second component of recovery, and it's also the slow component of EPOC. Okay, so that's the first, nice and easy as a comparison to what we looked at in our first and fast. Next one. Okay, the key functions then of, as I said previously, key functions of the slow component of EPOC are basically looking to remove lactic acid that we've accumulated during exercise, and also to replenish glycogen stores. So post-exercise, if we look at how this happens, and this is an interesting point now, lactic acid readily converts back to pyruvic acid. And this is a really, really important point, because we think lactic acid is a negative, kind of harmful byproduct. But what we have to understand is that when oxygen it comes into the system, this lactic acid can actually prove quite beneficial. So the first thing that happens is it converts back to pyruvic acid, and then the thing we need to look at, I mean, if you remember from the aerobic system where we kind of had a look here, or sorry, the glycolytic system, and it went down to this bit here to lactic acid. Okay, so what we're having a look at now, when oxygen is available, e.g. the aerobic system, what happens, as I've said over there, the lactic acid actually converts back into pyruvic acid. Now, from there, two things can happen. It's either oxidized, okay, which I'll show you in a second, which you'll be familiar with, or it's converted into glycogen. So straight away we've got our two functions about to be understood right now. So if I have a look at kind of what we're talking about, the key thing then is this lactic acid being converted back to pyruvic acid. What we have to do now is have a look at the ratio of pyruvic acid and how and where it converts to. So the first thing that happens then is that 60%, so ratio 1 of pyruvic acid, because that's the thing that lactic acid is converted back into, 60% of pyruvic acid is oxidized and it goes into the Krebs cycle. Now you will remember that because this process here, so pyruvic acid, oxidized, and it goes into the Krebs cycle. As a result of the Krebs cycle during recovery, okay, it produces CO2, which you can breathe out, it produces water, which you sweat out, and it also produces energy. to allow us to recover. Now, the second ratio from within pyruvic acid is there's 25 to 30% of pyruvic acid reconverted into glycogen and glucose. Okay, as you can see on the red bits here, so glycogen and glucose. Now, these have got some kind of relatively complex terms, but the complex terms are always the things I think you really try and attack and try and make sure you remember. So, when our pyruvic acid is reconverted into glycogen, it's done so via a term called gluconeogenesis, which is then that allows the glycogen to be stored in our liver. And finally, the glucose is converted via gluconeogenesis. And this allows us to top up our blood glucose levels. So that's the kind of thing we've got onto there. I think I've made a slight issue there. That one should be glyconeogenesis. So if you can change that U to Y there for the glycogen, and that will hopefully allow any mistakes to be overcome. So going on, the final bit then, we've got 60%, 25 to 30%, and then a final ratio, the leftover pyruvic acid. Where does that go then? Well, 10% of that pyruvic acid is converted into protein. And when we convert it into protein, we can remove it via sweat and urine in our recovery process. So that has a quick look through then. So we're looking at this, what, how, ratio. Okay, so ratio is split into 3, so we have to look at the split of pyruvic acid into 3 separate percentages. Okay, that's that first section done then. So next thing we have to look at then is the oxygen required to fuel this kind of slow component of EPOC. So the oxygen required then is 5 to 8 litres. Okay, so that is the key thing. So 5 to 8 litres, if you remember before, it's quite good this because the fast component was 1 to 4. There we go up to 5 to 8 litres of oxygen required for this one. Now, in order to kind of really get the difference between the fast and slow component, we have to look at kind of specification reference, the elevation of 3 things, and I've talked about them a little bit before. So to really help and enhance this slow component of EPOC, the elevation of 3 key things is vital to our recovery process. Now the first elevation refers to the elevated ventilation rate or our breathing rate or a respiratory rate. And obviously that's massively important because the ventilation or breathing rate that this allows actually fuels this kind of 5 to 8 litres of oxygen required for our slow component of EPOC. Now, on top of this, we also have an elevated circulation, okay, which works alongside our ventilation and breathing rate. Circulation we might understand better as heart rate. Okay, now what this does, if your heart rate rises, okay, that will obviously increase your stroke volume, which will increase your cardiac output, which will then allow the following things to happen alongside ventilation because we're getting more oxygen into our bloodstream in the first place. So circulation alongside ventilation, when they are elevated when we finish exercise, remember they don't go straight down, this allows the following things to happen, which we kind of all understand. It's stuff that we've talked about from really the start of A-level PE, which is kind of the fact that it delivers the increased amount of oxygen to working muscles, and it also allows us to remove that kind of the waste product here, carbon dioxide. It also allows us to remove lactic acid in the way that we've seen before, back it up there when it sort of converts back to pyruvic acid, and it also allows us to maintain venous return, which is really quite important because it allows that blood to return back to the heart, preventing things like blood pooling, okay, which can be really detrimental to us performing and recovering, and that's what gives you that DOMS or those aches after you've exercised if you don't cool down. Okay, so going on, the final elevation then, which is the only one we haven't talked about with the fast component, refers to this. So you also have an elevated body temperature. Okay, so this elevated body temperature allows it's in exercise, but your body temperature remains high following exercise and in our slow component of EPOC. So what happens by having an increased body temperature, increase the metabolic rate, which basically means that we continue to break down or burn calories. And what that means is that we can break down glycogen and fats in our recovery process in the aerobic system to allow us to produce energy, to allow us to recover. And hopefully that makes sense to you. So that metabolic rate that metabolise the fuels that we need for energy. I give an example of those down here. Now, if I go down to final thing, the time then taken for the slow component of EPOC is actually 1 hour. Okay, so 1 hour, but depending upon the intensity of your exercise, if it's really exhaustive bouts of kind of glycolytic system work where the lactic acid is going to a really, really high level, it could take up to 24 hours. So the slow component of EPOC takes up 1 hour to 24 hours. So I've kind of tried to put the kind of triggers here that you can use. So these could be the start points for your Cornell note questions. So make sure you've done those and just kind of try and make sure that you can kind of see, I suppose, if you start to look ahead and see where the kind of acronym or the kind of memory method is going here in terms of our key question triggers. Okay, so have a go at that. Make sure your notes have got these key triggers in them when you're asking questions. Okay, thanks very much.